Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. Today we're going to be discussing a topic that I would like to call conundrums of the edge. And with me to go through this, I have two great fellows from Cisco. I have Vaughn Suazo, Distinguished Architect. Hey, Vaughn, how are you?
I'm doing great, Michael.
Excellent. And then we also have Matt Gillies, Cisco Fellow and Chief Architect. Matt, how are you doing today?
Great, Michael. Thanks for having us here.
Excellent. Thank you guys for joining us today. So if you look at this quick slide that I have up, conundrums of the edge. What are service providers really looking for? Well, I believe that they need some simple, integrated, high efficacy, end-to-end operational solutions that are going to allow them to deploy and manage assets at the edge. And in particular, the networks that connect all those assets. But what does this really mean? First, the edge is transforming. What we thought was the edge before is not the edge today. And honestly, I don't know that there's really any single definition for edge. Automation and programmability are going to be key to making this all come together. When we're talking many assets, how do we actually manage the life cycle of those assets? And then finally, full stack observability. So when we look at what we're really trying to do, we're trying to achieve business outcomes. And the only way to achieve those business outcomes is by being able to observe the applications and their behavior on the infrastructure. So Matt, I'd like to go to you first. I specifically talked about the edge and mentioned that there's really not one edge that we can really consider. So how would you define the edges that service providers are going to have to consider in this context?
Thanks, Michael. Great question. And, talking about the edge kind of reminds me of talking about SDN 10 years ago or something like Zero Trust today, in that everyone's definition of the edge is a little different. And the way we think about the edge is there's at least four edges. The four edges we're thinking about today are really, the first is the SASE edge, SASE being this intersection of networking and security being cloud delivered. Really important transformation for all customers. The next edge is really the application edge. So this is an application like a security function, a web application firewall, something like caching that really defines the perimeter for that application. The next edge is really the enterprise edge. And these edges are often industrial applications, IoT applications. Often they have unique characteristics like ultra low latency, used for use cases like AR and VR. And lastly, the one that we're going to spend a lot of time on today is the carrier edge. And this could be a cloud service provider edge that's offering public cloud services, or it could be one of our cable customers building edge services very differently. They're taking the services that were historically built in a purpose-built platform and they're cloudifying them, and they want to push them out onto what used to be kind of general purpose data center infrastructure. So that's a complete paradigm shift for really how we build the edge applications themselves, but also how the operators manage them. What are you seeing, Vaughn, in terms of the kinds of edges and what are customers thinking about as they begin to really think about edge strategy?
Well, thank you, Matt. And I like how you kind of put that together. For me, it's been interesting as part of my role. I engage with customers and talking about edge. What are they trying to accomplish? What are their goals? What is the business driving? And Matt, this is what aligns to your point around all these edges, and Michael brought up too. I find that the different personas look at edge differently. I found this within one carrier, and that one persona looked at edge as, hey, we want to bring 5G to an enterprise prem. Where another persona wanted to bring 5G to a stadium at the edge. And they all had different concepts, and really points to, Matt, and I think this is what you're alluding to when we talk about our strategy around four edges, is you really have to step back in the persona, one, just the example I gave, but also the application requirements, which seem to be diverse. But I mean, for our audience today, and for what makes it so interesting for Cisco, the principles behind it, though, the lower latency, the reduced backhaul, getting real close to data and being able to do analytics, these are things that are very network relevant. So that's where we tend to bring in the network relevance. But the conversation, Matt, you're right. We got to match it up to that persona and the application they're wanting to go. There's no one size fits all, which it can be fun, but also can be very challenging and complex.
It's a really great point, Vaughn. One of the things that really strikes me about the persona aspect of this is that each of those personas are going to be looking at the edge as a different type of opportunity, right? And you specifically called out the network persona. So with that in mind, what are your thoughts on the edge network architectures that we're going to have to deploy, and how do things specifically like RON impact those architectures?
Oh, very good question, Michael. So I've spent some time with our routing experts. I'm fortunate I've got 3 of them that are around me all the time. And we were talking about edge, and I was just like I did with you guys early on. It's the applications. Well, they made this point, which resonated with me, is with respect to RON, where we're providing innovation, bringing routing and optical together. The use case, they said, is this is going to expand the capabilities of where we can now have places to put edge computing. And I said, well, clarify what you mean there. And they're telling me, say, hey, Vaughn, today, a lot of these edge locations, they're optical connections. All right. And applications don't rely on optical connections. They rely on IP connectivity. So, Vaughn, we're talking to the customers now, especially in the cable space, that are now saying, we're going to take advantage of RON. We're going to bring routing IP to those locations where we only had optical connections. Now we have more options in terms of where to put computing strategically. And now that the important thing is, if you think about that, is these apps rely on IP, all right? They don't rely on the optical connection. Now you could bring those IP services right to the compute in that location. It makes no sense to put edge computing in a location where I don't have IP, and I have this notion that we'll just backhaul that via the optical to a centralized router and then hairpin it back down. That just kills the latency problem right there, all right? Number 2, there's a lot that we can do with IP today. We do it in the cloud or the data center today with IP, like BGP and BFD. Track endpoints, they come and go to be able to track them. So we have optimal forwarding, things like that. We do a lot of tricks with IP there. So the whole notion of RON is going to give us more opportunities to put edge compute, at least where the business says it makes sense for the applications, versus what we have today. So I'm looking forward to that, my friend. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, I think, when we think about RON, to your point, Vaughn, it's a significant transformation. And it really kind of comes down to 2 things. So why is RON really resonating with customers today? The first is that there's been a shift in economics, where at about 400 gig, the equation really changes, and the costs are really dominated by optics technology. And what we've done from an innovation standpoint is we've been able to shrink the coherent optics so they fit in a standard pluggable. And that's important because now there's no trade-off. There's no, cost, in actually leveraging RON technology inside a routing platform. We're not burning kind of east-west ports versus now north-south ports. So we're actually really able to get the economic benefit deploying RON that we never got in the past. And I think that's significant. The other part from an innovation standpoint is how we actually manage the infrastructure. So being able to look at the IP and the transport infrastructure together with a common management platform, and look at planning and look at redundancy and look at how we actually size a given service, that's profoundly changed. And that's going to help operators manage their assets with a lot more granularity and frankly, with a bigger picture around the total investments that they need to make.
Matt, that's a really great point. I'm keying in on 2 words that you just said there: bigger picture. And for SPs, I think this idea of a distributed edge really does force them to look at a bigger picture. Specifically, as 5G enters the fray, what are they looking at for their network architectures, combining their 5G and mobile and residential and access? It makes them really have to look at things like a CIN, a converged IP network. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, what we've seen is that we're radically simplifying, to Vaughn's point earlier, the network based on IP. And so we've moved, away from RF-based cable delivery to really leveraging IP as the common transport for all networks. And often the way the operators are approaching this is they're looking at how they converge the underlay using IP, but then also how they build IP-based services over the top. And really what the ask is, they want to build those services obviously in a programmable way. They want to ensure that they can map those services to the transport and be able to enforce the right policy and the right characteristics for the service. And they want the infrastructure adaptable. So they want to be able to change the infrastructure depending on the kinds of services they wish to offer. Vonner, what are some of the other things? I know from a data center perspective, there's been a lot of influence in the way data centers have built and really using that, because now we have really all these micro data centers everywhere. What are your thoughts there on the implications of the infrastructure?
You bet. And I like how you frame it. You're talking about IP services converging towards that. I really love the point there. And it goes along with a problem that we've discovered. And we called it a connectivity air gap problem. So you look at edge compute, we kind of see some different personas today that edge compute could be something from a data center or a cloud that is placed in the network, and it has its own networking inside. Typically some type of underlay overlay combination, all right? And it's managed by whoever is operating that edge compute. May be different from the operator operating the network. They too have a network service. They too have what you could say is overlay services, VPNs, tunnels, and things of that nature. But these things today, there's no standards yet that says, well, let's map this service from this provider to this service in this edge cloud compute pod, I'll call it today for the conversation, and make them work together. It's typically the operator in some ways got to be able to stitch that together. And that's going to kill the conversation we're going to have next around automation programmability. So trying to understand, now we've done this in the data center map. We've done a pretty good idea of being able to coordinate that underlay and overlay in the data center. And I would also credit the large hyperscalers who operate large public clouds. They too have done it very well. So we've got to take that concept with the operators to be able to do that. And I believe that's where we're going to see a lot of innovation. And IP is at the bottom of that, all right? But it is as simple as I, as an operator, I've got a fast lane that I know you as an application need for low latency. I've got to be able to expose that to you so you can consume it, which again, I think Matt's going to get into the next topics of the conversation. So IP, number one, yes, that's the whole idea behind RON and things like that. Can we close this air gap? I think that's a great opportunity for Cisco to start doing. And there are ideas that we're starting to see that are popping up that does provide promise for the future.
Those are really good points, Vaughn. I don't think that maybe we stress enough the idea of underlay overlay and how that's really impacting the way that SPs are going to have to build their networks for the future, right? I mean, we saw this in the data center with VXLAN and EVPN. And I think for SPs, it comes down to how is segment routing going to transform the way that they're able to build networks that are service aware and can actually make those services available to customers in a meaningful and profitable way, right? So Matt, I'd like your thoughts on segment routing and maybe even specifically SRv6 and how SPs can use that to differentiate their networks.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I mean, I think, we've seen, amazing interest and deployments that are happening with SR. And this kind of goes back to the point we were talking about, the opportunity and really the requirements are driven from the need to have a flexible network. It really comes down to how you map application behaviors in a programmable way to the underlying network. And the really interesting thing about segment routing, it gives you that ability to have complete control over the forwarding paths in the network. And it does so really abstracting the network. So you get the ability to kind of map those application policies to the underlying infrastructure and use whichever data plane makes sense. And in many cases, as you touched on, Michael, it's really about an SRv6 aware infrastructure, providing unbelievable scalability that was never really possible in the past. So we've moved kind of away from, a way of doing traffic engineering that had, frankly, some inherent scalability limits. And now we're actually not needing to maintain per flow state for applications. We can perform kind of an aggregate, and that gives us scale that is profound and is something that we can really amplify as we introduce more services into the network. But Vaughn, what are some of the other challenges, and what are, I would say, the benefits that you're seeing in using SR as your primary, networking delivery mechanism?
Again, I like how you bring this so to upward at a level here, Matt. I guess that's why he's a fellow, Michael. He's very good. But let me see if I can expand on that. I'll do my best. I stayed at a Holiday Inn last night just so I could stay with Matt on this conversation. So I'll do my best. I've heard this analogy used that Matt's talking about segment routing, that we now can have these paths to convert, being able to aggregate state. It's now almost like some say, why can't segment routing or networking be made as easy as DNS? So today, DNS, an app will make a request to a DNS repository to get a mapping of name to IP. It's very simple, and it scales the internet. We'll flip that around to where Matt was going. What if I, as an application, I make a request, I want the best path or the lowest latency, it's a reference, just some type of reference. And I can make that to the network, and it returns what in a term used in segment routing is a SID, a segment ID. Just put this at the top of your packet and you'll get what you want. As simple, easy peasy. And that's kind of back, that's where I went back to. There are some things happening today that are very promising for the future, in that the host data planes, which that's going to be the networking at the edge, it's going to play a big role into it. They can do segment routing. Things like virtual packet process, vector packet processing, enhanced Berkeley packet filters. There are these layer 3 routing data planes in the host that can take advantage of segment routing to, as what we talked about, close that air gap. But the context now is, how does an application consume that? It can't be in a way like we do today in terms of stitch this for me, or, hey, Mr. Application Provider, we think you love the network and as nerdy about it as we are. We're going to throw you a bunch of dashboards and BGP feeds and all this other stuff. They don't care about that. They want to consume it almost the same way as, hey, I know how to request CPUs. I know how to request memory. I know how to request storage. It's all very simple. Now make the network consumable. So, yeah, I like the ideas where Matt's going. That's what we got to get closer to the application to close that air gap at the edge. And I think that's where operators will find success, because now I can now build a service. If it's easy for the applications to consume, guess what? That kind of becomes sticky, the same way as these app people use services in the public cloud. That's what became sticky to them. So I love it, Matt. I think that's what we've got to get to. It's just close that gap with the applications to get that type of networking to it. And it does, to your point, it does simplify it in a way that it can be consumed. Good points.
Yeah, this is great, guys. This conversation has been really wonderful so far. I mean, we've touched on the different types of edges. We've talked about, some of the network architectures that are going to have to be put in place. We talked about some of the protocols like segment routing. But I think I heard you both say the word scale a number of times in the last question. And it's occurring to me that we are talking about a massive scale of new devices that are going to have to be deployed, that are going to have, day 0 through day N operations imparted on them. So how do things like network programmability and automation play into this? Specifically, I'm a quasi-coder. So, when we think of cloud applications and cloud platforms, we've got to be mindful of state versus stateless. And there's a very different way that you approach a stateful application versus a stateless application. So, Matt, I know you've got a lot of this in your heritage as well. How do you think that we look at that?
Yeah, this is another really important question around network transformation. And I used to present a slide, Michael, to customers, and it had a swivel chair. And I used to say, every time you've got a manual process, that's an opportunity for automation. And service providers have really taken that to heart and looked at moving away from a CLI with a mop to an API is the primary way in which they interact with infrastructure. But to your point, to kind of get to automation, you really have to evaluate, A, what it is you're going to automate, and then B, what kinds of tools you need to use. And you touched on it, and it's really an important and probably misunderstood fact about accomplishing automation for infrastructure is that we have this whole concept of immutable or unmutable infrastructure, or pets versus cattle. And it kind of turns out that in a network, we often have state. When we configure a network device, there can be a relationship between that device and another device in the network. And because of that relationship, we actually need to track configuration state. And so when we make a change to one device, we want to make sure that that change is also reflected on the other device. So we need to track state for the configuration. And not all tools can actually handle kind of state management from a configuration standpoint. But it might turn out that in certain areas in your network, that's okay. If you're configuring a top of rack switch and the configuration is simple, you're putting all the ports in one VLAN and it's a one-time change, then you probably don't have to go back and change that device, and it might not have a relationship. But if you're changing an edge and the edge has an IP address that has a routing relationship, an adjacency relationship to another device, from a configuration standpoint, now we got to track state, because if we make a change on one device, it may break our routing protocols on the other. And so thinking about the right tools, and when we talk to customers, we say, well, what tools are you using? And they're kind of saying, we use everything. And so they need to bring them together. There might be a different tool that they use in the data center versus the network. But end to end, they really need to think about the orchestration they use across all of these tools that's necessary to deliver a service. I know, Vaughn, this is also an area you're really passionate about. Tell me what you're seeing from an automation perspective, and what are the kinds of challenges customers are facing, and where do you think they still have some work to do, and where are they being successful today?
Before I answer that question, I'm going to do something for our audience, because I've noticed, and we talked about this, we are so polite. Oh, that's a great question, Vaughn. Oh, Matt, that's a very great point. I just want our audience to know, when we don't have the cameras on, these ideas don't come from a vacuum or everything. They come from passionate conversation. So while we seem so polite on camera, if you know who we are, there's an excellent battle technically going on in the background. So if I could just provide that to our audience, we are totally polite today on this thing, but we're all brothers. So while we're having some fun today, now let me get back to answer Matt's question. There's a lot of challenges there. I love where you're going in terms of the state, and that does impact the networking. I would say that's probably been the biggest holdback for many in terms of the automation, is that the concerns with what happens if we make this change, be it scripted. I think, Matt, we dealt with this with the customer a long time ago. Garbage in only does one thing: garbage out. So while there's been a lot of improvement in that area on the networking, I think there's a long ways to catch up, because we've studied some of these applications. I'll give you an example. Netflix's CDN. Now, you bring up this good point. When you do things at the edge in a distributed system, one part of that system breaking can be catastrophic to the rest of the system. So when they build these applications at the edge, the first thing they do is that we have to be able to tolerate failures in a part of the system that does not become catastrophic to the other parts of the system. And in some ways, we may have to look at the networking, maybe where we could do less, where we have to have less state about those endpoints and more about the paths. Number two, the idea that I think where we're at today, Matt, in terms of automation, is that most customers have data, and most customers are now getting insights into that data and are now bringing in the third bubble, action. All right. So now with data, inventory, and insights, we have some devices that are not running at the operating system version we want. We can now take an action that we can now use scripting or tooling to go out and automate the upgrades. All right. Where that needs to go, and I think this is going to be a favorite conversation of yours, Matt, because I certainly look to your leadership here with the BUs and driving this, is that now the last bubble, in my opinion, is the policy bubble. And this means we now have programmatic access to the network by which that action becomes now a policy by which we can track, a policy that we can, hopefully, Matt, create this closed loop creation, something David Ward talked about. You and I both agreed years ago when he showed that to us. And we bring in that policy piece. But we got to get the network to be in programmatic, which in my opinion means we've solved the automation problem. We're now ready to say back to the air gap problem, the apps. Now we can get those services can be consumed at an application layer without hands-on keyboards and any operations, because it's going to have to be quick. And that's how cloud operates. I think that will start to transcend down to the edge. How? Will it be the same? Will it be faster? Will it be slower? I'm not sure yet, because we're early days. But I do know that the one thing that will not work is for an edge service, an edge application, they need an network service. What will not work is sign up a ticket, sign up a contract, in 6 weeks, we'll get the service up and running. That, at least I know, won't work.
Vaughn, that's a really great point. Specifically for these edge services and these edge applications, you talked about cloud just a moment ago, and these are going to be widely distributed applications, right? This isn't a 3-tiered app running in some public cloud or in a private data center. These are widely distributed applications that are going to rely on the network. So how do we make things like
Kubernetes
observability?
Exactly. Michael, thank God for Kubernetes, because I'll put this also out there, Michael, and I'm keeping a close eye on this. Kubernetes will play a role. There is no doubt. We're already seeing that in the telco space with 5G. It's already made an impact there. The next one is function as a service. And everything we just talked about just comes full scope now when we start thinking about the edge and what's happening there. So totally agree with your points, my friend.
Yeah, at that point, everything becomes code, right? Everything is code. But how do you monitor that code? How do you monitor those apps? How do you ensure that whatever service level agreement you've given to your customers, be they external customers or internal customers within your own company, how do we make sure that we're actually meeting those agreements? Full stack observability certainly has got to play a role here. But I'd love your thoughts, Vaughn and Matt, how we actually make this come to fruition.
You want me to take this first, Matt? Because I'd really love, Matt, you to kind of finish up, because this is really your area of expertise. I just have something very simple to say to it. In my experience, as we look at full stack observability today in our strategy, part of that is what we can do at the application layer. Okay, very good example is AppD. Okay, AppD is instrumented into the application. And my point being, and this is what I'm talking to our teams about. When you're talking about the application, here's the big eye opener. You're now talking more about the business side of it, not so much the infrastructure side of it. It is the business side of it that how are we measuring our customers' experience? How are we measuring the transactions that matter most? And so there's this definition of the business metrics first. And this is why I like when we talk about full stack observability as a strategy moving forward, is that we can take the strategy, we can help customers drive this, but we drive it closer to the application layers, all right? And this makes a total sense for edge, because we're not really going to be able to say there's one size fits all for edge. I confirmed that in the very beginning of this conversation. There'll be different types of infra. Comcast may have one set of infra, Charter another, AT&T another, AWS, all right? So at one point, we're able to talk about the business side of it, regardless of what the infra is, but then bring it back to the infra, because we probably have an audience that's like, hey, Vaughn, it still matters. And I agree. Your overlay is only as good as your underlay. Our whole ability to be able to tie those together means that now the infra has a closer alignment to the business side. And that's what I see as being very exciting. And the way we can scale that, I think the customers that's where they're looking for our leadership. The scale is going to be key there. Some areas we scale well today with our FSO strategy. Other areas for edge, I think we're going to have to work on. So, Matt, I know you got great things to say about that. What do you think, my friend?
I think, Vaughn, you touched on a number of really important points. What we know today is more than ever, the application is the business for customers, and they really want to connect the business insights down through the infrastructure. In the past, they built parallel teams to manage kind of the network and the application, cloud infrastructure, and really things are more complex. We have more moving parts now, and the common ask is, how do we kind of reduce the mean time to innocence? How do we figure out where the problem is and get resolution? And the way we've thought about this is really through a framework, a closed loop framework that we call VIA, Visibility, Insights, and Action. So visibility is really how we get that telemetry from the underlying infrastructure. Could be from the network, could be from the cloud, could be from a server, but we need to get telemetry. And then how do we basically look at the telemetry information, have insights based on the domain it's perhaps coming from. And then to your last point, how do we take action? So this really leads us to a closed loop environment where we can connect what's happening in the business to what might be affecting that from the infrastructure. And this is going to be a huge area of investment, I think, for service providers to really provide richer telemetry that can be harvested and used by the applications directly. And we kind of look at how we need to monitor the entire digital experience. No longer kind of from the router that's the DMARC to the customer, but all the way up to the actual application that the user is running. And so being able to kind of embed that visibility from an APM perspective, obviously we do that with AppD. We need to do that in a more agnostic way. We're going to have an ecosystem of applications. So I think the underlying infrastructure has to be able to provide those insights via telemetry. And then operators are going to need to provide that to our mutual customers. And that really is going to allow for this closed loop architecture where we can respond much faster to the business. So I think it's a really exciting area. I think we're at the very beginning of this journey where we still got to figure out, where we get the telemetry from, how we aggregate that telemetry, how we deal with that, for environments that we don't control. As we know, the internet has become, really critical for business operations, but there's no one, person that controls, or one company that controls the internet. And so you need to actually be able to measure the digital experience outside of your own network and then correlate those insights back up through the application. And that's kind of a journey that we're on today. We're leveraging, some new technology that we acquired last year, as you guys know, with Thousand Eyes, but we're really instrumenting the network so that we can complement the insights that we get from that solution with other, could be Melt, could be open telemetry, could be other insights that we're actually able to garner through the infrastructure. So really important area to focus on, and I think a huge opportunity for service providers to add more value for those applications that transit their infrastructure.
Those are all just really salient points, Matt. It occurs to me that throughout this conversation, we've hardly mentioned a single Cisco product. And I think that really speaks to the journey that Cisco was on, because it's not about selling boxes for us anymore. I mean, we are really selling innovation. And it's one of the things that makes me just so excited to be working at Cisco at this point in time. It's just really, really wonderful stuff. So I think in summary, first of all, thank you guys so much for your time. Thanks for this great conversation. I think it was just really, really valuable, and hopefully the viewers will find it valuable as well. Just really thought-provoking topics that we've touched on. But, I think I would like to bring it back and discuss maybe a little bit of why Cisco really can play a role in the larger edge conversation. And I think probably the first thing is that, we have solutions that are going to work in every edge. We've got, and really software-based solutions that are going to provide visibility and capabilities in every edge. I personally think we're leading the industry in automation and programmability for pretty much every network type. Whether we're talking about distributed data center, whether we're talking about these micro edge data centers, I think we've got the innovation and the capabilities there. And finally, I think Cisco really is the only company that has the complete portfolio that can provide visibility across networks, security, and applications, and do it in just this wonderfully homogenized way to make it consumable for our customers.
Well said, Michael. I think that's a great summary, and really happy to be here, and thanks for the conversation.
Thank you, Michael. This was fun, my friend.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. Cisco is extremely passionate about technology, but even more passionate about our customers. And we'd love to hear from you. So if you have any thoughts or opinions or ideas, please reach out to us.